admirer of his work, and indeed as the director of the St. Jerome Centre, to welcome Professor James Cameron.
It's a great pleasure for me to be here, not only because I've heard so much about the St. Jerome Centre, but also to be present in an institution presided over by a former pupil. I was trying to think if I had any interesting anecdotes about Michael to contribute, but I can't think of anything that is repeatable. But he's the kind of student that no professor ever forgets. The distinction between the laity and the clergy is not historically the same as the distinction between the ordained and consecrated bishops, priests and deacons and so on, and the rest of the baptized faithful. It's the distinction between clergy, clerks, clerics, those who could at least read and write, and were often more highly educated than that, and those normally without these accomplishments, knights and peasants and people of that kind. Although the distinction isn't drawn in this way anymore, not even in England, where down to the 19th century somebody who could read and write could, in relation to certain offences, plead his clergy. This was England, of course, has more of the Middle Ages than any other country, and it was a relic of the time when clerics could commit various abominable crimes without receiving the same kind of punishment that lay people receive. Well, even in England, this no longer exists. But the symbolic load, as it were, of this distinction between clerics and others does survive down to our own day, especially in that great section of the Catholic Church I call the Anglo-Hibernian community, which of course covers not only England and Ireland, but also the United States of America and Canada, outside Quebec. The Reformation, of course, was the end of the clerical caste system by which certain subjects were professed by, because they were only known by those who were clerics, whether bishops or priests or not. Certainly in Protestant countries it ceased to obtain from the 16th century onwards, and in those countries deeply affected by the Enlightenment, the distinction again became less marked than it had been in the Middle Ages. But certainly down to almost our own time, certainly down to my time, those Catholic groups that for whatever reason placed the virtue of obedience to a lawful authority very high in their list of virtues tended on the whole to shy away from theological culture of any kind, or if they got it from sources outside the Anglo-Hibernian community, in the 19th century from Germany, and perhaps in the 20th century from France. The consequences of this situation were disastrous, not so much for the laity as for the clerics. Theology became for the most part a seminary and not a university subject. Patristic and medieval studies were neglected. No way of bringing this up, is there? Or perhaps there is. There's a knob here.
This is modern technology here.
That's we're turning it the wrong
I'm
way.
going the wrong way here. Was I going the right way? Counterclockwise. There we are. I think. How about I... Is it actually moving?
Doesn't
Doesn't. Yes, I know, but we keep turning this and nothing happens. I don't know if it can go higher. See? But it should be able to. I wonder if Blue's here. Should be. Yeah.
No, please don't bother. I mean,
No,
I can hold this up near so that my eyes can actually see what I've typed.
No, we should be able to get another one. Must be lodged with something. Probably made by some Calvinist.
Well, they were rather big men.
Is that a wisecrack?
Anyhow, I can do this. This is quite all right, if you don't mind. When Newman went to Rome in the 1840s, after his conversion, he was told that St. Thomas was out of fashion. Nobody reads him here. And when Leo XIII, in his famous encyclical, 1884, was it, 1883, Aeterni Patris, commended the study of St. Thomas, I think the idea was to bring up theological studies from the seminary to the university level. The general consequence of this development was the separation of ecclesiastical culture. Oh, thank you very much. Nice. It's fine, it's fine. As I say, the general consequence of this was a separation of culture into two streams, ecclesiastical culture on the one hand, secular culture on the other, and this in a period when immense advances were being made in natural sciences, in historical studies, in criticism. Some Catholics did indeed contribute to these advances. In history, the Benedictines of Saint-Maur, the Mabillon and his colleagues, Richard Simon, Vico in the 18th century, and more Catholics in the 19th century. But all this went against the grain of the prevailing system, as the occasional sad collision with the Holy Office showed, and this became very striking at the end of the 19th century with the modernist crisis. And I want now to quote two passages from one who played a great part in the modernist crisis, Baron von Hugel. These two passages, I think, bring out in quite concrete historical terms the problem I shall be concerned with. In the first, von Hugel is writing in 1904 to a Protestant correspondent. And he writes, "I see two sets of facts over against each other, and they are both true, and the same principle which makes me admit the one set also forces me to proclaim the other. I admit that since the saddening division of Western Christendom, it has been your people, not mine, who have all but monopolized political freedom, and who in great part occasioned, and then far more readily practiced and believed in, the essential doctrine so largely lost during the Middle Ages as to the unjustifiableness of force in matters of conscience. And again, I admit that it has been your people far more than mine who from, say, 1700 onwards have carried on that reverently free research and have improved and increased those methods of inquiry which the best of the Renaissance scholars and indeed many 17th century Catholic workers so largely founded." Well, I think the Baron here is taking a rosier view of Protestant culture in its fundamental character and tendencies than one would be inclined to take today. But he's interested in making a contrast and continues by portraying the strengths of Catholicism as consisting in a higher degree than Protestantism often attains in a capacity to produce, I quote, saints of a depth of otherworldliness, of a delicate appealing heroism, and of a massiveness of spiritual wisdom greater than I can find elsewhere. That was in 1904. 16 years later, in 1920, there's a later letter which bears on the same topic. He writes, Catholicism was in Aquinas' time, and even still in More's time, that is Thomas More, a great intellectual culture and a rich training school, as well as the home of saints. But since, say, 1720, and still more since the French Revolution, it has shrunk more and more to being, usually and easily, just that home, that is the home of saints. The culture and the school lie now very largely elsewhere, and I do not say to gain, but even fully to retain such culture and such training within the Roman communion is now distinctly difficult. Of course, no one could write in just this way today. Much has happened in the 60 years since 1920. The effects of the changes in the social and natural sciences have been felt within Catholicism. There are many signs upon which we can fix as telling us the distance we've travelled. One is the abolition of the old index of prohibited books, that formerly, at any rate, required one to get episcopal permission to read the works of Descartes or Erasmus Darwin's poem, The Loves of the Plants. It's odd that it was Erasmus Darwin, not Charles Darwin, who landed up on the index. Another, of course, is the appearance of such a biblical commentary as the Jerome commentary. This would have been unthinkable even 30 years ago. Another, and I would regard it as the most important indication of a change, is the Vatican II decree on civil and religious liberty, Dignitatis Humanae Personae, a decree which in effect repudiated the ecclesiastical positions of more than 1,000 years. There are many other signs of the absorption of the Church into the ethos of liberal culture, and to persons of my age, this is so very intoxicating that we're inclined not to notice the negative phenomena, of which perhaps more later, that go with this. All the same, much remains in part as a kind of habit of thought and of feeling. Much remains of the old division of labour between those who are in a formal sense clerics and those who are not to be classified as clerics. And yet the situation is that many of the laity are now clerics in the old sense, and some of the clergy are perhaps no longer clerics, but rather professionally social workers. But what is the Catholic intellectual life we're talking about? This is a hard question to answer, much harder than it looks. It can't just mean the intellectual life of Catholics, whoever they may be and however they're situated and irrespective of their occupations. There is no Catholic arithmetic, no Catholic engineering, and it's a nice question whether or not there is Catholic history. What is it then that Catholics think about when they're having or enjoying a Catholic intellectual life? I presume it is when we're concerned with God and his self-disclosure in the Old and New Testaments and in the presence and activity of the Holy Spirit, who comes from the Father through the Son. In one way, this would be to draw a very large circle around the whole of human life, and thus would include all human thinking. So that even if it's true that we do arithmetic qua human beings rather than qua Catholics, the world is as it is. And this means, among a vast number of other things, that arithmetic is a human worldly activity totally dependent upon the fact of creation. Catholicism, we might say, is the truth of humanity. This means that when a Catholic, and of course any other theist, reflects upon what he is doing, whether it's an arithmetical sum or watering the garden or whistling a tune or thinking about foreign policy, his reflective life is necessarily different in ways hard to define from the intellectual life of other people. What he reflects upon is human and is in its character exactly like what is done by others, but his stance is different, even though in many cases the kind of thinking done isn't changed by being reflective. But being reflective as a Catholic about all one's intellectual activities must be a part of what we're being asked to do in view of our calling. For we're asked to love God with all our minds, and we're certainly told to be concerned about the truth in all things. And I suppose we have at least a confused belief that somehow or other our stance, the way we look at all those activities that we have in common with all other human beings, makes a difference to the world we live in. It seems then that we've reached a stage, at least in what we might call Western societies, Western Europe, North America, when those who are educated may well wish, and many of course do wish, to be reflectively and self-consciously Catholics in their intellectual lives. And I suppose this will hold especially of those who are involved in one way or another in the great educational establishments that exist in all the advanced Western societies. Not only high schools and universities, but a great variety of other institutional provisions for the higher education of the population. Indeed, the existence of the St. Jerome Centre and of parallel centres in other countries is a witness to this fact. There is plainly a ferment among Catholics in the professions and an unwillingness any longer to accept the old division of labour of the, I think one has to say, the pre-1966 period. This has happened both as a consequence of very deep social changes and as a consequence of that, I can only say happening, quote, happening, unquote. We still don't fully understand the Second Vatican Council, itself perhaps in part a reflection of these social changes. I don't want here to exaggerate. There were always prominent laymen, such men as Chesterton, Maritain, Gilson, as Thomas More and Pascal long before them, just to mention the most illustrious, who were plainly in one sense or another Catholic intellectuals. But in our time they were either literary men with a vein of originality, as Chesterton was, or they were scholars engaged in the assessment of officially approved work, as were the Thomist scholars Maritain and Gilson. When they stepped outside this role, as Maritain did especially with his books on politics, notably Humanisme Intégral, and with, above all, his intervention in the affair of the Spanish Civil War, they provoked immense controversy and came into collision with the great centres of power within the Church. Of course, they were often, ironically enough, speaking on behalf of many of the clergy who couldn't raise their voices. As the Church then was, it was extraordinarily hard for diocesan priests to take an independent line in public and religious matters. And of course religious were greatly bound, much more than they are today, by their duty to their superiors. History is full of ironies, and one of the ironies is that just at the moment when the educated laity should have been coming into their own, the system of higher education, at least in North America, to some extent elsewhere, that is from secondary education upwards, should have gone into a catastrophic decline. I don't mean quantitatively, obviously it doesn't, but qualitatively. What I can only call the Americanization of higher education, which is even now affecting such extremely conservative and traditional societies as France. I won't go into details about curriculum, methods of teaching, etc. I've done all this already on the idea of a university. But I'd like simply to point out what is defective in the knowledge and experience of many of those who come through the existing process of higher education, what is defective in the sense that it makes it hard for them to engage in specifically Catholic intellectual activity. This isn't, of course, true of all who come through this process. I'm only talking about what tends to be the case if other influences don't counteract the tendency. Now, I shall talk in more detail about this problem later, but I want to interject at this point some other things that I think are methodologically important. Learning anything at all seems to confront us with a set of paradoxes. In order to know, say, B, we must first know A, where A is a condition of our understanding B. Real cases, of course, are much more complicated than that. Suppose you want to teach someone, you're teaching in political philosophy or political science, and you want to teach someone the meaning of the word sovereignty. You'll find it easy to do if the person you're teaching, although he doesn't understand sovereignty, already has such concepts as those of obedience, rule, what it is to follow a rule, and power. If he has these concepts, then you can teach him what sovereignty is. Of course, if he doesn't have the concepts of obedience, rule, and power, then you'd have to begin further back, perhaps with a parable or a fairy story or a domestic situation. Of course, how we ever get round to acquiring concepts is quite a puzzle, but I won't go into that. To acquire a large set of concepts and of facts in which they're embedded and the emotional tone that goes with them, and to reflect upon Catholic tradition with profit, requires that we should be thus equipped. This is a necessary condition of any large enterprise in the field of learning. And what equipment do we need to begin to think profitably about our religion? I want, again, to interject something. I want to make it plain. This is, those of you who've read Newman's idea of a university, we're familiar with this idea, that to think profitably, I'm not talking about that activity that goes with leading a sanctified and thus in the most fundamental sense a profitable Catholic life. Sanctity has no necessary connection with learning or with intellectual power. It's certain that there are very many holy people with very low IQs, not university material, we should be inclined to say. I think the Curé d'Ars was probably such a one. So that, I mean, the people who really deserve the most illustrious crowns are very often not people that really are concerned in any self-conscious way with leading a Catholic intellectual life. This is what Newman is getting at when he extols the gentleman and then suddenly undercuts everything he says by saying, well, but of course, being a gentleman is perfectly compatible with being a profligate and a scoundrel. Now, the question of how we're to get going, as it were, in our intellectual life religiously speaking, has always arisen in some form from the earliest period, when the principal task must have seemed to be that of working out the relation of the new gospel to Judaism. So that unless you understood Judaism, you couldn't in a sense understand the gospel. And indeed, as you know, in the earliest period there was quite a strong view among some Christians that to become a Christian you had first to become a Jew. That the gospel really went with observing the law. Then there's the period when the Hellenistic world was so penetrated by the new religion, so that believers were to be found even within Caesar's household. And the question was then bound to arise, and was framed, of course, very famously by Tertullian: what has Athens to do with Jerusalem? What has the academy to do with the church? Of course, he was asking this as a rhetorical question, assuming the answer to be nothing. But of course, we can ask it in a perfectly reasonable way. What indeed has Athens to do with Jerusalem? What has the academy to do with the church? A great deal was the final answer. It was resoundingly answered in the age of the councils, when the word book of ancient philosophy was ransacked for terms in which to express the safeguarding definitions, especially of incarnation and Trinity, as, for example, at the Council of Nicaea. A later intellectual crisis was the rediscovery of Aristotle at the beginning of the age of the universities in the early 13th century. What we're faced with today is the failure of the church, a failure now being remedied, to come to a full encounter in the age that followed the Reformation, with the intellectual changes that took place on, so to speak, the church's threshold, but are only now being let into the temple. And all this coincides with the rise of an educated laity, many of whom want to share in intellectual work. Now, one thing seems to me plain about all the intellectual transitions in the history of the church, those for example, I've been talking about, alongside the desire, indeed the necessity, of coming to terms with certain intellectual problems thrown up by human curiosity. I mean, in the age of the councils, what is a person? There's also the requirement of retaining continuity with the primitive deposit of faith. I mean, Catholic thought isn't just bombinating in a vacuum. It has necessarily to be related to what is given in Revelation, and the regulative principle that Revelation ceased with the death of the last apostle binds us to a fidelity to the primitive deposit. If Christianity were not a historical religion, if it were simply a religion of timeless principles, as is Buddhism, at least under some interpretations, this problem wouldn't arise. But it's linked with the apostolic preaching, which has to remain a norm for all periods, and to Jesus of Nazareth crucified under Pontius Pilate, as we say weekly. The death of a particular man at a particular point in time, a real man who died a real death on a wooden cross in the fashion of the criminals of that time. We're always therefore faced with the problem of loyalty to the deposit of faith. This is the faith of the church. This is what has always been believed. Combined with loyalty to the truth, historical, scientific, whatever, as we're bound to hold it at a given time. There are two imperatives, in a way, in the Christian intellectual life: the imperative of revelation, fidelity to the apostolic preaching. On the other hand, there's fidelity to what seems to be probable or demonstrated truth in other fields. And this means that our attitude to tradition can't be the same as those who are not committed in the same way to history. I don't mean, or I don't only mean, our attitude to tradition in the technical theological sense of the old two sources theory, that there are two sources of faith, scripture and tradition. I'm not talking about that. Rather, our attitude to that culture within which Catholicism has been embodied. We sometimes groan under the dead weight of this culture and long to be free of it. And it seems to me it's quite an understandable feeling. But we can't be, simply because this culture is the bearer of the saving tradition from which we feed, without which we should starve. Without this culture, of course, we shouldn't even know that there was a saving element in this culture. And without some knowledge of this culture, this is the A being the condition of understanding B, without some knowledge of this culture, we can't understand the saving tradition. I mean, if one, for example, were to read one of the Gospels, John or Mark, with no knowledge of Judaism, one would certainly misunderstand them completely. Much would be mysterious and uncanny. Perhaps a lot is mysterious. But certainly without a knowledge of Judaism, we can't understand what the point of much of what is written in the Gospels may be. And I don't mean the kind of understanding that goes with intellectual sophistication, not simply that, because we understand the culture in question in part simply by being brought up in it from our cradles. A reflective, critical understanding of this culture, something we're here inquiring into, is another thing. But it's all the same inescapable once we've begun to ask certain questions. Let me give an example. I hope I'm not a scripture scholar, and I hope scripture scholars present won't think I'm trespassing on their ground, but this seems to me an example that, shall I say, a layman could very well understand. In that staggering second chapter of Matthew's Gospel, we're given in rapid succession the stories of the coming of the Magi, their encounter with Herod, the arrival of the Magi with their gifts at Bethlehem, their departure to their own country by another way, the flight into Egypt of Joseph and Mary and the child, the massacre of the innocents, and the return of Joseph and his family from Egypt and their settling in Nazareth. All this in one short chapter. The intentions of Matthew, of course, are many. Some of them can be read off from the text to stress the reception of the gospel by the Gentiles, to emphasize the role of Jesus as the new Moses, and so on. And as registering these intentions and others, the narrative couldn't be bettered. But we do seem to be faced with some puzzles here. First of all, this material is peculiar to Matthew. There's no trace of these events in the work of the only other evangelist with an infancy narrative. In Luke, the only other evangelist with the infancy narrative, we're given the circumcision after 8 days, the presentation in the temple, and when they had performed everything according to the law of the Lord, they returned into Galilee to their own city, Nazareth. Not a trace of these remarkable events. The Magi, the coming of the massacre of the innocents, the flight into Egypt, and so on. All this is totally absent. Now, just because it can't be with us as it was with those who lived before the rise of modern history, and also because we are as Christians bound to a certain ethos, that of respect for historical facts, since our religion is founded on fact, we're bound, I think, to look again at Matthew's narrative and to puzzle over it. We can see that his work is not like that of a modern historian. And certainly it's not the work of a bystander. It isn't, as to some extent Luke's Gospel is, the work of a historian who's compared various accounts. It's not like that of an ancient historian such as Thucydides either. One thing is certain, he's passionately interested in the symbolic meaning of events. He's interested even in stories that, as it were, to teach us something and express something. The question of the place of the Gentiles in the plan of salvation, the story of the wicked ruler who tries to destroy the rightful heir to the kingdom. This is a universal story. You find it all over the world in all kinds of fairy stories and myths. It emphasizes that theme of peripeteia, the turning upside down of things, that's so powerful in the Gospels and in classical tragedy. The first shall be last and the last shall be first. The powerful ruler who wades through blood to his throne will be cast down, and the despised one, the rejected one, will in the end rule. Also, Herod repeats Pharaoh's oppression, just as Jesus in Egypt is a second Moses, to whom the words of Hosea, "Out of Egypt have I called my son," are applied, as they've already have been applied in rabbinical commentary to Moses and to the children of Israel. The conclusion seems irresistible. Whatever we may be the case about the historical material, if any of it underlies Matthew's account, the evangelist's primary interests are theological rather than historical. What he seems to want to teach us is that the church is the new Israel, that the redemptive work of Christ is a universalizing of the redemption of Israel from Egypt, that the redemptive work of Christ is a universalizing of that the authority of the existing politico-ecclesiastical authorities has come to an end. These are central themes of the apostolic preaching, and it shouldn't perhaps surprise us that Matthew shapes this part of his narrative to bring home to us these things. Now here, an awareness of the theological tradition rescues us from the insoluble problems posed by a fundamentalist reading of Matthew 2. In thus trying to solve the problem presented by Matthew 2, we're at once children of our own time, children of the critical idea of history, and yet adherents of the sacred tradition, which becomes the key to the interpretation of the historical difficulty. I want now to return to the question of our existing higher education and its function of leading Catholics to a profitable encounter with their own tradition. I've already said that there has, in my view, been a catastrophic decline in the way higher education is carried on in North America, but to some extent in other places too. I'm not castigating North America especially, and indeed I'm not castigating anybody, for I think that what has gone wrong is not primarily the fault of individuals who could have done things differently, but is rather a consequence of changes in our society. In the first place, our literary culture is in decay. Perhaps there's more reading now than there used to be, it's hard to know. But the elite, those who end up as serious students in higher education, no longer read in the old way. Their childhood and youth are not often, at least, preoccupied with reading of a general kind. as childhood and youth often were. Boys and girls who wanted to study the humanities in higher education used to arrive at the university already having inside them a fair acquaintance with a canon of literary and historical works, and with a sense at least of the great outlines of European history from the Greeks onwards. And this acquaintance with a certain kind of tradition was in part acquired not so much through formal studies as through a kind of osmosis, a kind of soaking up. One picked up a good deal of historical and other information simply through reading Shakespeare and Milton and the great novels. Some of it, of course, was misinformation, and some of it was distorted. But even a rough and inaccurate framework is better than no framework. It would then have been psychologically impossible, I think, certainly when I was an undergraduate, for a student under interrogation to say, when asked about some literary work or historical period, and I've often heard this answer in Toronto, I didn't do that in my high school or in my first 2 years at the university. I haven't done Bleak House yet, or whatever it is. Of course, this might have been the truthful answer when I was an undergraduate. But one would have been too ashamed to offer it. One would have assumed that one ought to have read this or known this historical period. I suppose one had some idea, some kind of model of the well-read, the properly educated man, and would have aspired to be considered such. Again, reading is to some extent, even physically and morally, a different activity. Reading was a process of looking at books that were physically like the books of the 19th century and earlier. Indeed, often they were these books. The reading done at home or in a library was a leisurely process. One picked up the book off the shelf or off the table, turned the pages, noted in a subconscious kind of way the typeface, the publication date, the balance of the black type on the white or the cream page. Individual books even had their peculiar smell, as did an old library, so one would smell a book as well as looking at it. Now, such experiences are still available and are still enjoyed by some, but there's much evidence, I think, of the way in which the young are occupied from the time they become able to read to when they enter high school and later university. Much of their occupations are simply incompatible with acquiring the traditional historical, literary, philosophical, linguistic culture in any degree. There's a pervasive ethos of fulfillment, self-realization, which is interpreted as hostile to the acquisition of traditional culture. It emphasizes contemporaneity, relevance, the psychological understood as sanctioning a somewhat Rousseauist version of the process of intellectual and moral development. And then all this turns sour, as it's doing at the moment. When it turns sour, the immediate reaction is to think that the remedy for pious waffle, which is all you get out of this kind of thing, is to be found in making education utilitarian and vocational. More important, of course, perhaps, is the intrusion into the home of mass entertainment of a debilitating sort. Of course, here in North America, things are much worse than they are anywhere else in the world. In Europe, nothing quite so idiotic and corrupt as the American situation comedy or the soft-corn cereal or such a program as Love Boat is to be found. Though there are very disquieting signs that when these programs are introduced into, say, British television, people enjoy them. But what is essentially disquieting, I think, about television is its encouragement of passivity. And better television, as in Britain, may well make things worse for one virtue of North American television is its boring quality. Although, of course, even a boring kind of entertainment can become an addiction, as I'm sure you know from inspecting people. At any rate, it's plain enough that there are many forces that make against private reading, reflection, and especially against solitude. An important condition for reflection and for learning to be able to endure periods of solitude. Solitary and reflective children are thought to be weird. I won't go on with this. Everybody knows the phenomena associated with the corruption, the intellectual corruption of the young. Of course, I don't mean that we have in a couple of generations passed from a world of gold to a world of brass. Elaborate formal education has always in some degree gone against the grain. This is why it's very important at an early stage regular verbs or whatever it was, so that later this will become mechanical, it just become conditioned reflex, so that you wouldn't couple, as my undergraduate students are always doing, a plural subject with a singular verb. You wouldn't do it not because you knew better, but because you simply had a set of habits that made it impossible for you to do it, unless it was a very long sentence and the subject was so far away from the verb. But why does retaining in some form the traditional culture matter fundamentally to Christians? Surely Christianity is able to mix with, to coexist with a great variety of different cultures and with different degrees of intellectual sophistication. My answer would go something like this. We can imagine how some things in the past could become absolutely unintelligible. Just time for one anecdote, perhaps. This is a teaching anecdote. I once, some years ago, had a very good class, a class of people who'd been really sifted out. They were A students. And we were studying the Leviathan of Thomas Hobbes. And we were studying, this must have been the second meeting of the class, I think, Hobbes' own introduction to Leviathan. And there's a marvellous passage in this introduction when Hobbes says that the compact that makes the Leviathan, makes the state come into existence, he says this resembles that fiat, or let us make man, pronounced by God in the creation. And so I said to the students, now, the 17th century was a Bible reading age, and therefore there would be present invisibly on the page, after let us make man, certain other words that are very important for an understanding of this passage. And what are these words? Now, these were A students who had been in, mostly I think in Catholic parochial and grammar schools. I said, does the word image help anybody? Now, this seems to me to be slightly blood-curdling. It really means that the whole doctrine of man being made in the image of God, and all that's involved in that, in the whole history of Christian thought, isn't known to people who have in fact received an intensive Catholic education. Or, as I assume, they had. Of course, they hadn't, obviously. Or if they had, they'd received religious education which was so on the margin of their interest that it had never soaked into them. I'm sure they must have heard about the doctrine of the image of God, that man created in God's image, but somehow it had gone away. It's like you're forgetting how to ride a bicycle. It's not even that, but you don't forget how to ride a bicycle. You get on the bicycle 20 years later and you ride. So that we can imagine how certain very important things could become unintelligible. You know, just so baffling that you just give up. And we could thus miss the inwardness of much of the past. We couldn't really read the Gospel. There are some things in ancient literature, I think, that are very hard to understand. For example, the guilt of Oedipus. This is very difficult for us to understand, I think. We have the notion of the man being guilty in respect of something that he done deliberately. But here is poor Oedipus, who kills his father and marries his mother, but doesn't know it. You see, he doesn't do these things under those descriptions. And yet, somehow, in this way of thinking, that makes no fundamental difference. He's done them, and therefore he incurs necessarily the pollution and the punishment. As I say, we find it very difficult to get inside that, I think, in our day. So that even now we can point to certain bits of ancient culture and say, well, this is too difficult for us anymore. We can't really enter into it altogether. Now, suppose we could no longer respond to the inwardness of, say, Shakespeare's heroines, to Rosalind, as we like it, or understand the moral perplexities of the characters in Jane Austen's or George Eliot's novels. More seriously, it might become the case that biblical characters and issues become blurred and incomprehensible. David's guilt in respect of the wife of Uriah the Hittite. For example, consider the issue that's central in the New Testament, gaining the whole world and losing one's own soul. It would be superficial to describe the situation as Catholic preachers used sometimes to do, horribly, I think, as a choice in which saving one's soul was the prudent choice, the choice that a really shrewd man would make. There must be something ignoble about this, and of course a total misunderstanding of the New Testament, as though this, saving your soul was a kind of exercise in the high utilitarianism. But what is in question is one's view of what it is to be human. One of the great modern heroes and martyrs is an obscure Austrian farmer called Franz Jägerstätter, about whom Gordon Brown is coming here later, I think, has written a magnificent book. Now, Jägerstätter was a quite ordinary chap. He was not a learned man at all. He was a peasant. He was also the village sexton. He looked after the graveyard and that kind of thing. But one thing was quite clear to him, that to serve in Hitler's army was like, putting the pinch of incense onto the brazier in front of the image of the divine emperor. That this was, strictly speaking, sacrilegious and blasphemous. And so when they came for him, he refused to do it. He refused to serve. And in the end, they just chopped his head off, or garroted him in a cellar in Berlin. Now, one of the interesting things is that all the better educated men, his parish priest and his bishop, because he went to see the bishop, they said, no, these matters too high for you. It's not your business to worry about the rightness and wrongness of these things. But his answer was, everybody knows what the German armies do in the countries they occupy. To which, of course, they had no reply. Now, this was a man who understood the contrast between gaining the whole world and losing one's soul. There was an even more extraordinary situation in one of the death camps where medical experiments were done. And this was a testimony of a Polish woman doctor who said she was discussing with another doctor who was also a prisoner in the camp, Dr. Oval, a French woman, what are we to do about these terrible things that go on? They were being asked to cooperate. Dr. Bell made a wonderful remark. I don't know if she was a Christian of any kind, but she said, you realize, of course, don't you, that nobody will be allowed to live having witnessed these things. And of course, in fact, they did live, but simply because they ended the war case. And then Dr. Bell said, the only thing we can do is to go on living as human beings, which meant not to cooperate. And here again, you see, not under theological labels, but under, in the most important way, somebody again understands the saving one's soul as against gaining the whole world. Now, but there is a sense, I think, in which, in a climate totally corroded by moral relativism, good for me, right for him, this kind of thing, that this could become inaccessible. People like this will be thought to be dumb, stupid. You may even have come across students who take this view. I have. Now, I would argue, you see, that what has hitherto kept our moral and religious tradition alive, at least from the standpoint of an intellectual appreciation of it, I'm putting questions of grace and so on one side, has been a combination of classical and biblical culture that has penetrated the vernacular cultures of Europe and, of course, of North America. And this was reflected down to our own day in the curriculum of the grammar school, the lycée, the gymnasium. Virtually all those who've been the makers of the modern world, all the great natural scientists, Marx, Max Weber, Durkheim, Freud, were all brought up in this way, under this curriculum. There's Greek and Roman epic, tragedy and comedy, the world of the biblical narrative, the heroes and villains, both in themselves and as they were later refracted in the later work in the vernacular. Virtually the whole of vernacular, from Chaucer and Shakespeare, Milton to Yeats and Wallace Stevens and Henry James, draws its substance from that sense of the past which is necessary for a sense of our historical identity. It's a matter of great importance, quite apart from our interest as Christians, that people shouldn't suffer from total historical amnesia. It's just as catastrophic as total amnesia of the ordinary clinical sort. It's more important still for Christians, because amnesia for us will plainly be the end of everything. Of course, it's a part of our faith. I know that in the end this can't happen. But some bad things can happen and have happened. Take, for example, that powerful breakdown in our culture represented by the ICEL translations of the liturgy and some of the current modern versions of Scripture. The flat culture in which we live, without savour, plagued by jargon, is reflected in these translations. I don't know if anyone noticed that the term values has actually started appearing in the Sunday collects. Values. This, I suppose, for those, instead of having those things that are good, we have values. It's then a central task in Christian education, a task for Christians as teachers and students trying to brighten up their intellectual life, to study and to restore not simply Christian culture narrowly understood, but the whole of our rich and many-sided culture, because that's the A that we have to know in order to understand B. This doesn't mean to be repetitive and to prostrate ourselves before the past, and of course we belong to our own time and not to any other time. Nevertheless, the tasks of the lover and of the Bible and of imaginative literature and of history, all these tasks which impose themselves upon human beings, are also especially tasks for us as Christians. Now, I'm not going to go into detail about what can be done practically to remedy this situation. I'm more concerned with diagnosis and with discussing how far the diagnosis is right. And the mutations of Christianity have been so varied that it's perhaps dangerous to assume that there's any necessary connection between the persistence of the gospel and the persistence of what we call high culture. Learned Christianity has, after all, often turned out to be superficial and without life. Think of the fact that before the French Revolution, such a man as Talleyrand should have become a bishop. Scum. Now, although, polished and learned, it may be that the intellectual life of Catholics will be reawakened in ways that we just can't anticipate, and from quite outside Europe and its culture. I'm not ruling this out at all. I'm simply concerned with the tasks that face us in our own milieu and in our own time. I don't myself believe that there's much possibility of radical change in the high schools, in the universities, except here and there, when remarkable men somehow carve out a little niche for themselves. In any case, you see, as Marx once said, the educators must first themselves be educated, and modern-day educators, when they expatiate on educational matters, do so in a systematically evasive jargon drawn from pop psychology and sociology. They solicit input. They go in for consciousness raising. They ask that we should relate to people and issues in creative ways. This I've elsewhere called parasense. Others have called it psychobabble. And the educational establishments and the social service establishments are drenched in this jargon. So it's very difficult to see much light in that direction. I think we simply have to try and do the job ourselves. And this will probably mean education of people of mature years in the St. Jerome centres and other places of Catholic adult education. And how to do this isn't altogether clear, but some of the things we have to do, as in how to do them, are clear. I think, first of all, we have to know much more general history. History, I think, is a key subject. We need to have a framework so that we could place in a correct sequence, not date, but just place in the correct sequence, say the Galileo case, the date of St. Mark's Gospel, the First Crusade, the end of the Byzantine Empire, the Davidic monarchy, Johnson's Dictionary, the Communist Manifesto, Shakespeare's King Lear. Now, I've purposely mixed them up. If you can put these in the right order, that is a great deal. For many of us, I think, certainly I've tried to test students in this way, the past is just a blur. But the sequence of, for example, the end of the Roman Empire in the West, the foundation of Benedictine monasticism, the Crusades, the rise of the universities, of scholasticism and the Gothic, the end of the Middle Ages, the coming of the Renaissance papacy of Leo X and all his successors, these are matters of great importance to us as we try to understand ourselves as Catholics. Second is Scripture. And thirdly, a study of the theological classics. Most of these are available in translation. We can read Athanasius on the Incarnation, we can read Augustine, we can read Anselm, Aquinas, Pascal, Fénelon, right down to Möller and Newman, and in our own day, Congar and de Lubac. These are our classic theologians, not sources of infallible pronouncements, but men whose work has been tested over a long period. Men who are the fathers, not the children, of the Second Vatican Council. About later men and women, I wouldn't pronounce, because I've been talking about people of my own generation, and sometimes people of a later generation I don't altogether understand very well. Well, there's a list of subject matters for Catholic laity wanting to exercise their intellects, and I think within these fields we have ample material to do a good job of self-education. But once again, in closing, let me say that I want to say that intellectual cultivation can never be central for Catholics. The concern with charity and justice, a hunger for the supernatural life of grace, these are closer to the centre of our Catholic concerns than intellectual cultivation can ever be. Indeed, there is a sense, I think, in which great intellectual or artistic gifts place us in peril, just as material riches do. We are rich if we have great intellectual gifts. And just as riches are a distraction and a snare to the soul, when they're things like money, so I think they can be when we are rich in this other sense. But the intellectual life also serves these things, simply because getting our minds clear is sometimes a necessary, though I think never a sufficient condition, for understanding the Church's continual repetition of the apostolic preaching in our own time. Thank you.